All right, this is the February 15th, 2022 meeting of the Node.js Loaders team. On the agenda today is import.meta.resolve and its relationship with the web API, as well as the ambient loaders proposal. So why don't we get started with import meta resolve. I'm going to try to find the Google Doc and get that started. Maybe Guy, do you want to introduce this?
Hi. Yeah, great to see everyone. And thanks for making a slot for this at the last minute. It's appreciated. Yeah, so basically, this has been something that's been going on for a long time. Discussions of import meta go back many years in import meta resolve. And I guess it's a path that's been laid for the web where a synchronous import meta resolve has been the goal of those working on the web specs. And to kind of fill in the picture on the web spec side of it, if you think of it all the way to like module redirects were designed so that they return the URL that's returned for the 301 redirect is a separate URL in the module record. So it's not deduped at resolve time. So that way network redirects are still synchronous, as we're having some discussion there now. Also import maps are carefully designed to make sure that their resolution is synchronous. When you load an import map into an HTML page, that import map delays all module loading on the page until that import map is loaded. And only once the import map is finished loading will modules start resolving. So no modules are executed until the import map is loaded. If the import map request is blocked, all module execution is blocked, even if it's completely unrelated to the import map. And as soon as you've loaded a module, the entire HTML page switches state from a waiting for import map state into a import maps ready state. And that's a one-way state change. Once it's in that import maps ready state, it can never go back to loading import maps. In fact, it throws an error if you try to load an import map on the page afterwards. So at all these different levels, it's kind of designed around this. I don't personally agree with all those decisions, but it's not really my place. For example, I think that it's a problem that we can't have dynamic import maps, because I think there's a lot of use cases where users want to be able to dynamically load mappings, and we see that with ES module shims and System.js. And there are ways to make that work. Again, whether that implies a synchronous resolver or not is another question and another sort of rabbit hole on this line of thinking. But I think the focus for today was, when it comes to Node.js, we designed the most general loader hooks, a completely asynchronous resolver. And since the web is looking at implementing a synchronous import.meta.resolve, and we've already got an async one behind a flag, do we want to try and come up with a coherent Node.js position where we can say that the Node.js project feels it wants an asynchronous resolver for these reasons, or maybe the Node.js project doesn't have any need for an asynchronous resolver, and therefore we're willing to take the path of compatibility, or some kind of middle ground where we could say that we're undecided. And so that's the kind of options. If there is a unified path, it would obviously clarify things and make things simpler. It's obviously a lot simpler for everyone if there's a spec that works across platforms and solves a general use case. And it's nice to align with that if we can. And so to try and have that discussion about the Node.js needs for an asynchronous resolver, if that's something we see as being useful in Node.js, or maybe useful or not useful at all, and just to get some opinions about that topic, to see if there's a unified position we can potentially bring back, or if anyone has any opinions on that.
Bradley, can I just ask him a question before you launch it? Okay. Could you just clarify to me, they seem like really determined that they want everything to be sync, like for refusing to allow more import maps loaded after the first one's loaded, etc. Why is that? Like, why are they so determined that like, yeah, we are sacrificing the potential of dynamic import maps or future import maps or hot loaded import maps in order to like keep everything sync?
I think it's mostly I don't think there is any major driving use case or that I know of, at least. As far as I'm aware, it's a kind of a simplicity thing, where in particular with dynamic import maps, not wanting like if there's any ambiguity about what the resolution will be, because ambiguity could affect if you've already started loading some modules and then the map changes and then you're loading new modules, does that mean you don't have a well-defined resolution? And I think there are ways to tackle that question, but as I say, this is a rabbit hole that's very web specific, where maybe we can try and focus on the node specific arguments. Or if there's time, we can dive into that more, perhaps. I don't know.
Go ahead, Bradley.
My understanding of not why I raised my hand. My understanding of their desire for it to be synchronous goes all the way back to when Miles was helping with the import map spec get formed out. There was objection from Chrome, not from other browsers, to adding things to the task queue in order to perform resolutions. They felt it would be too slow.
Okay.
I don't agree with it because you don't actually add that many tasks. You add one per entry point, really, and you do the rest behind the scenes. But they disagreed and they felt it would be too many.
Okay.
So they wanted all resolution to be synchronous, and as a performance gain way back then. They would not compromise on that.
Do we know if that is still the case?
I do not have any contacts currently at Google in that area.
Well, anyway, what was your question that you raised your hand for?
I think, yeah, I raised my hand because I think before we get into all this argument and stuff, we should also question like what the end user story would differ if we had an asynchronous one and the web had a synchronous one. Like, if we don't agree, how much damage would it be? And my stance is minimal at best. If you always add an await, it works in both environments. And then
yeah, I was just gonna say that you can await a
so
non-async thing.
the problem here is the type systems people use. You would get into weird situations where people are upset that they can't use stuff synchronously in Node. Equally, people would feel a little confused as to why there's not a consistent return type from this in a generic type system. So, but
something I don't quite understand is we are not talking about the resolution of Chrome by itself. We are talking about import.meta.resolve. It's an API that most people will never actually use. It will only be used by very special projects. So why wouldn't this API be able to be asynchronous? Or browsers?
So to be clear, the expectation of this API is people would use it to load things that are not able to be imported. So you could resolve things like images that you can't use import to get a hold of.
Oh, so like if you had a bare specifier, like import.metadata resolve a string foo/image.png or something like that.
Yes, that could work.
Is it also potentially used for workers? Because those are imported, they're not imported, they're
imported against the base URL. So yes, it could be useful for workers.
That sounds like something that might be quite widespread, no?
Yeah.
And,
there are workarounds for this that people have existing today. But
I mean, it sounds like it could be, it's not quite that. I would assume that maybe it's not quite that obscure. Like, we don't have import, like we just added sort of import of JSON, but we don't have import of WASM yet. I could easily see people wanting to do import.metadata resolve to get the path to a WASM file that's out of a package, and then they use fetch for it, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, this is perhaps like a fairly general use case.
And with most functions in the web platform usually being async nowadays, wouldn't it make sense for web browser to implement it as resolve sync, kind of like what Node does?
You mean resolve async?
No, to call the function resolve sync and to resolve to be async.
So there's a design philosophy in WhatWG not to use the word async and sync. So they don't want to name it something like that.
So back to your question, Bradley, are you saying what is the damage if there is divergence between the specs, where to locate your WASM in a cross-platform way, you would have to rely on top-level await with import meta resolve, and then it's just in the synchronous case that await is just doing nothing. Is that kind of what you mean about framing that scenario?
Yeah. So like trying to come to a conclusion that everybody in this room agrees is a difficult one.
Yeah, and the conclusion can certainly be we need more time to discuss it and engage about it. I mean, at the same time, this is something that has been on the list for a long time, where if it is something, yeah, a convergence is obviously a good thing. And then the other hypotheticals, should we go through those perhaps?
I'm asking about the damage just so that we could really like prioritize this. If there's almost no damage, if we disagree, I don't think we really need to discuss it.
Well, I think it's a lot more likely that people are going to write code for browsers not thinking of how it's going to run in Node, and so they'll write it expecting to be sync, especially if that's how it's documented in like MDN, et cetera. And then
we do
like
see
rather than someone
yeah.
writing it for Node where they put the await and then it happens to also work in browsers, I think it's going to be the reverse, where they write it to work in browsers and then it crashes in Node.
So we can force it to look and appear synchronous in Node, even if under the hood it's
well, that's like cheating. We're like,
well, that's what the browser
synchronously or something
too under the hood. So they're actually doing IPC under the hood for this. So like they are doing that, and that's part of what's implied by Dominic's comment in the WhatWG, where he's not asking for any way to convince them to be asynchronous. He is only asking in his comments to convince Node to ship a synchronous form. He's not asking for time. He's not asking for any of that.
I think
so we need to
he's
figure out how to ask.
He's being very inflexible. I think before we get to the question of like how bad would it be if we diverge, let's first even see if we want to diverge, right? So like what's my point on the thread was like, what do we lose if we just go sync for this API?
So Mael mentioned it, and we've talked about it before. You lose essentially any sort of concurrent IO operation that you may want to do. So a good example was you proposed something in the WhatWG thread where it uses the import maps synchronously. Well, using import map synchronously for Node, that the equivalent is using a policy synchronously. They do work synchronously, but at the same time, that means that any sort of delegation to use a policy has to be synchronous. You are preventing any form of large subsystems of Node to always be synchronous. And when you do file IO in particular, you don't want to block everything. Historically, for Node, this has been faster for our ESM loader, but that might not be true anymore. And it also means that for your hooks, when you write them, you have to know that your resolve has to be synchronous. And this is where we get back to the blocking thing. If resolve is synchronous and we have chaining, that means that any sort of chaining mechanism has to be synchronous. Any sort of isolation we do, like putting a loader in a thread, would be asynchronous in JavaScript. So we have to fake being synchronous anyway.
And specifically on, for example, the policy question, do you see there being use cases for asynchronous policy checks where this would be something that would be?
No, because they never do IO.
Okay.
That is a hard requirement of policies, is they must never do IO.
And you don't see any kind of like prompt-based permission systems in future that might want to like escalate a query to the user or something like that?
If they did that, they would want to halt the process. So it would act synchronous.
Yeah, at that point, we're not worrying about performance, I guess. Zach, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just curious about a detail. So like Bradley, you were talking about the basically user land implication of it being synchronous is that it would block all sorts of things. And I was relating that in my head to a comment someone made in the thread where, or one of the threads where like that was one of the reasons why like TypeScript, for instance, re-implements resolve was to make it asynchronous. My question is, what would prevent someone from just like basically wrapping that call inside of a promise and then taking advantage of the future infrastructure in order to get around that synchronous nature? Or is it the fact that resolve has to be implemented a certain way that prevents that kind of solution from being relevant?
So the reason that TypeScript and a bunch of other people do it, I'm sure Yarn has this somewhere in their re-implementation of stuff. You want to maximize concurrent searching when you have a search-based resolution algorithm. And so that's why they want it, because it, on average case, is faster. So that
You mean to be async on average is faster?
It's not about async, it's about parallelism.
Yeah.
Okay, but getting back to his question though, like say we did make it a sync API. If someone wanted parallelism, couldn't they wrap it in an async function and then, you know, do promise.all or something to await a whole bunch of calls to the async wrapper around sync resolve?
It wouldn't increase parallelism. It would still be one at a time.
So that each individual call would block the others?
Correct.
Thank you.
That is what the synchronous form does, which is actually okay on the main thread. Like we can fake being sync and have a worker thread do everything async still, which we already kind of will have to do anyway. So I'm okay with this solution.
Would that would make it non-blocking under the hood?
It makes the hook non-blocking in the thread, but on the main thread, it would block it. Sorry, Guy has his hand up. It's been up for a while.
I just wanted to get back to the design of the function a little bit. So I guess on the synchronous issue, as Bradley said, Node.js has a synchronous resolver, and it is actually faster than doing the FS that the resolver does asynchronously for whatever unknown reason. Also, with the resolver that we've got for ES modules, we already removed a lot of the statting, so it is touching the file system less, and as a result is more suitable as asynchronous resolver, in fact, than the older Node.js resolver, which was also synchronous. But the design of import meta resolve, it's the kind of modern version of require.resolve. And if you think of the use cases for require.resolve, it's the same use cases. So the first one that we discussed at the beginning, the asset loading, like finding a WASM file or something like that. And then the second one is to basically have a resolver that matches your import system that you can call out into. So if you think of the times that you've used require resolve in code scenarios, it's perhaps to locate a third-party module path or a module directory based on its path or something like that. And basically getting a hook into the node modules for resolution. And exposing the resolver in a way that any user can get access to it. The form that we have in Node is also slightly different to the browser in that there's a second argument, which is the parent URL. So you can pass any parent URL in and get a resolver as if it's relative to that parent URL. The browser spec, the PR that we're discussing doesn't actually have that, although Dominic does see that as a potential add-on in future. But the thing with the node modules lookup is that in theory, you could npm install new packages into node modules. And when you do require.resolve will locate the new packages that you've installed because it's looking in node modules. So I guess in Node, the same thing will apply. But in the browser, there's a kind of a restriction that you've got a more static module environment where you can't install new modules. And an asynchronous resolver that's the other use case I kind of see for an asynchronous resolver, is the idea that it could effectively act as a kind of a installation hook, where if the modules aren't present in the import map or aren't ready for the synchronous resolver, it allows you to have a place where you can say, here's the work that needs to be done to prepare the resolution for this package, or install it or make it present. And so that's the other aspect of asynchronous resolution. But that doesn't actually affect Node, and right now it doesn't affect the browser. So that's perhaps an argument for synchronousness, in that the argument doesn't actually have any weight right now.
Well,
but yeah.
Let me just propose this though, is like, we can always add some API that someone imports, like import resolve from module or something like that. Probably not that, but something along those lines. So like if they ship the one with only the one argument and we really want the version with Stu, maybe import.meta.resolve is the API that browsers have shipped, and then, you know, import resolve from module could be the version that takes 2 arguments or something to that effect. And it could be async, it could be whatever we want, you know, because then it truly is our API, and it's explicitly so.
Yeah, so like if we want to frame it like that, I think that's a great solution where we know we can force our async form to look synchronous, and we can tell people they can use it for compatibility reasons, just do this other thing for performance reasons. So anywhere down the line, like as a compatibility API, I think there is benefits in just matching. If we're trying to own the API, that's different.
Well, so here's another thought I was thinking in my head, was like, say you're trying to do import.meta.resolve, Lodash to pick up a package name. And in a browser that would only resolve if they had an import map loaded and that import map had an entry for Lodash to some URL, right? For Node, presumably that would resolve, like it would do a file system lookup to see if you had like /node modules /Lodash, etc. I think, right? And so the Node version would involve a bunch of file system calls, which we probably would want to be async. Now, or we could say, oh, import.meta.resolve only looks in your module cache. So if Lodash has already been resolved because there was an import statement for it, it returns that resolution. Otherwise, it throws or returns undefined or something, even though an import of that string would find it because it's not in the cache yet, or if and when we support import maps, because it's not in the import map that's been loaded, we return undefined, similar to how the browser would, either throw or return undefined or whatever it does when it can't find something in the import map. Like, is that how we would want ours to behave, or would we want it to strictly like resolve as if this was an import
I think
call?
you want to resolve because people are going to make just asset packages, which are just going to have like CSS or HTML.
Okay, so you don't want it to
something.
you don't want to require the user to have already imported. Well, they can't have imported it beforehand, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like in the case of, say, a worker, they can't really use it. They would have to have like just a useless import statement just so that resolve would work.
Okay. All right. So then forget that idea. I was just trying to think of a all right.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you're telling me that even though our version would hit the file system as part of like coming up with the answer for what the resolution is, if you're saying that we could still have a sync resolve and that's okay, and that's not a like major performance hit, then it sounds like maybe we just do ship the API that they're asking us to, and then if we want an async version, we can provide that in one of our Node namespaces.
I would say we can do what they want, but doing so requires us to do more than just expose the synchronous default resolver due to loaders. We have to wrap loaders in an actual
Well, could we?
atomics call.
So yeah, that's the next question is, if the resolve loader hook was altered to be a synchronous hook.
That's what I was just about to ask, because I was assuming we had to make the resolve loader hook sync as well. Don't we?
I think we do, because it uses it, doesn't it?
No,
It is an easier way if we can do it, but it is also possible, as Bradley says.
I have to move the loader off thread for HTTPS security reasons anyway. So
But
it's not
shouldn't
a significant difference.
But shouldn't the resolve hook be able to influence import meta resolve?
Yes. Yeah, but that's fine.
Right. So that's why I was assuming it had to be sync. If import.meta.resolve is sync and it's going to call some number of chained loaders,
Yes.
then don't they all have to be sync all the way down?
Only if they're on the same thread. So I
What
blocked
kind of
the
wizardry have you
That's
got up
not
your
something I've
stream?
ever done, of having a sync function on one thread, call an async function on another thread. So you'll have to give me an example of how that works, I suppose, because I'm not
we have some old
familiar
slides
with that
on
one.
it. I have a workshop if you want to go through it. I wrote basically on the main thread, there's this thing called atomics, and you say, hey, wait on this array that is shared between the two threads until this value changes. So index 0, wait for it to change. And then the main thread stops processing. The worker thread keeps processing the resolve, does whatever async jiggery it needs to do. And then when it's done, it tells JavaScript, hey, I'm changing index 0 on the shared array to the value 1. And that restarts the main thread.
So the main thread just,
Oh.
well, it is synchronous, so it just gets frozen for however long the async operation takes.
Yep.
Oh,
So
well,
you've,
that
there's a
sounds like the
way to
problem is solved.
essentially synchronously await async calls in JavaScript.
Yes, and we have to
Or
move
at
the
least- or
loaders
at
off
least in Node.
thread for a variety of reasons, in particular HTTPS, but there's also a request from the TSC to do it because there's security implications. It's making the rest of the code base a mess by keeping it on the main thread.
Well, I almost feel like maybe in the short term, since no one seems to be using async resolve right now as a loader hook, like I almost feel like making a PR that just changes both the loader hook for resolve to be synchronous and changes the experimental import meta resolve that we have to be synchronous and to lose the second argument. And just throw a PR up that does that. And that way we can shake out any other, anything that this group of the 6 of us is not thinking of terrible consequences to such a change could be hopefully shaken out by such a
So
PR.
it catches fire.
That breaks like everybody using async operations in their resolve custom hooks.
But I mean, isn't that the whole point? Like, if people are doing a lot of async work, then doesn't that prove that it's
Then we
something
want to
that is
know, because
useful?
I can't find a single example. None of our examples do it.
Node itself,
TS Node's not doing it. I'm sorry?
Node itself is making IO in order to make its own resolution
All synchronous.
for command. Yes, right now, but it doesn't have to be synchronous. It could
It
use
was slower
asynchronous
when we
IO.
did it asynchronous. So we benchmarked this multiple times. It was slower to do it asynchronous. That's why it's synchronous.
Even with ESM, where all the imports are known beforehand.
Yep, it was.
I still find it
It's
problematic
weird.
that it's not possible to change that in
Well,
the future.
I mean, if what Bradley's saying is true and this like magical way to await
Well, you have to
async code
remember-
exists, then even if Node wanted to use the async file system calls, we could do it through the thread thing in Atomics, like he was just talking about. So,
Yeah, so
right? I mean,
you also have to remember ESM only has very limited parallelism in actuality for its resolve. So really you're only getting parallelism for children of a single module record normally if you're doing async operations. So getting the whole tree to actually resolve all at once also clogs up the file system, and the disk access controller does not like that. If you try to open up 100,000 files at the same time on your disk, it is slower than opening up 100,000 files in batches of like 100. So
anyway, I think it almost doesn't matter, because like, even if for some reason it was faster for Node to have an async resolve, I think Bradley's saying that we could still have an async resolve under the hood that presents itself as sync to the loader hooks through
I
this
don't
whole
think it would
atomics and
work for
threads thing.
IO, right? So because the loaders would still execute within their own thread.
But I mean, there is also even if it's possible, it doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? So loaders right now, if they're doing asynchronous resolution, at least they're not blocking up the main thread when they do that. Whereas now that any asynchronous steps will fully block up. So it's like giving users sync XHR, right? It's a superpower, but you really don't want people to do it. So in some ways, it could also be worth encouraging asynchronous resolver by actually just making the synchronous resolver the default, at least, because you don't want users to have lots of async work that's just going to slow down and cause unnecessary performance bottlenecks. I do quite like the idea that it's a nice way to catch in the ecosystem async usage. Maybe it is too breaking. maybe there's a way to do it that's less breaking.
I
But
mean,
if it's very breaking, then that's
we could
Well, then that
just
tells us
put a
something.
warning in there.
a warning.
Say
when,
we're
when-
going to
yeah.
deprecate it if there isn't usage and put the warning up.
That could work.
I mean, it's already very experimental. I think we could just change it and see what happens.
I
I,
would guess that
There's no
people
I
are
don't want
probably
it to
not.
land in a release. That,
Well,
There's
while
no
we're still in
reason to break
17.x,
people
I mean-
unnecessarily. So
And
Yeah.
what about loaders that do heavy IO tasks? For example, with the zip loader, we need to load the zip into memory and start read it. So it's not immediate.
Is that part of resolution or is that part of in the load hook?
Yes, it's part of the resolution.
Yeah,
For
is
example,
it
in
supposed
Yarn,
to know
what
what's
we're doing
inside?
is that we are applying the node resolution algorithm inside the zip archive. So we are checking whether there is an index.js file. We are checking whether there is an index.json, this kind of thing. But we need to open the zip in order to make those checks, right?
not just open the zip, oftentimes you might have to deal with compression as well.
Yeah.
Because like a tar GZ has to be decompressed before you can even read.
So in
The-
our case, with zip, we avoid part of this problem because we are using zip, which has a random access. But for TGZ, it's completely true. It would have to be uncompressed before.
I mean, the other thought I had was that like you could have a resolve hook that's just like a pass through that doesn't actually change anything. And then in your load hook, like if the resolve hook was, you know, zip colon slash flow dash slash index.js or whatever, then you just pass that same string through without touching it. And then in the load hook, you can do all the async work of opening up the zip and blah, 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 because load is going to have to stay async.
So even more than all this question of if you can do stuff synchronously, most modules on NPM are not synchronous. So you're locking out huge swaths of the NPM ecosystem from being usable with loaders.
Well, in the resolve hook. Like, you mean like an
Yes.
NPM module to like decompress a tar GZ file, for example, it just like becomes something you couldn't use.
Like people don't give you access to synchronous APIs that often on the ecosystem level. But even with all this, like unconditionally, we're gonna move loaders off thread. So I don't know if we want them to block the main thread so it can't do more work at the same time. That's okay. But there's no reason to convert it to synchronous because we got a security complaint to move them.
And we're okay with those use cases, basically then stalling the thread on the zip compression effectively, right?
If the zip compression or whatever is on a
Or
different
use it.
thread. Yeah.
So basically,
Right.
the import.meta.resolve would be sync, but under the hood, it would call the async resolve from another thread and use atomics to block it and expose it as sync, right?
Correct.
Well, it sounds like we need to like prove that that's actually a viable solution then before we can, because that's essentially like, well, that's the best of all worlds. We match the browser API and we preserve our async resolve hook.
It's slower. You're adding some extra work there. Startup time in particular takes a hit of a 20-ish millisecond.
Like all the time or only when custom loaders are registered?
All the time.
Only when
100% of the time.
meta.resolve API is used, right?
Hmm?
Only when the import.meta.resolve API is used, it wouldn't
No.
affect
No, all
putting
the
them
time.
off thread. It was already on the roadmap, so it shouldn't.
It is, but when we move them off thread, it's not the best of both worlds. There are downsides to it.
Right, but we were going to move them off thread regardless of this issue, weren't we?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so then that's then
Like
it's
a
not a consideration.
as a
Like
paid-
that's like, yeah, there's a performance
something
hit for
we're paying
moving off
anyway.
thread, but if we were doing that regardless, then it doesn't matter in terms of import meta resolve, right?
I mean, you lose concurrency on the main thread and stuff. Like, if I have like 3 things where I do import meta resolve, like logo.png, import meta resolve, and then another thing, I don't know, like avatar.png. If I do all of these synchronously, I can't do them in parallel.
I
Which is
guess for
fine.
the tar use case, it actually does work out fine because the first one just blocks the initial tar, and then the others should hopefully have a cache that they're sharing. But yeah, if you're loading 5 different tar packages corresponding to 5 different tar archives, then you're not able to parallelize any of that work, certainly.
You mean through import.meta.resolve?
Correct, if it's synchronous.
Yes, but
Or even with the normal import, because it'll make the main resolver blocking and synchronous as well.
But Node could provide the asynchronous version of import.meta.resolve. If the browser platform is not willing to change the name, Node already has the.
Yeah, and we don't have to put it on import meta. We could just put it
The
on one of
browser
our
platform
APIs.
doesn't care if Node has the name. So.
Right. So can you just clarify that? You're saying if we go with sync, we could always add an async hook for performance in future. Is that the point?
I would say, yeah. I would say we most likely would. We most likely would immediately, just like off the ability to run.
Well, if we keep our loader hooks as, if the loader hook resolve stays async, then yeah, I could see us wanting to add some API that lets you do an async version of resolve. So import.meta to resolve would almost be like just a compatibility API to match the browser, and it would still resolve the same. You would get the same result as calling our version of the resolve API, but our version would just be faster under some circumstances.
Under specific situations, yeah.
I mean, are we confident that this is all doable? Like you're confident we can
Doable,
create an
good
import meta
idea,
resolve
probably
that's
not.
sync? Okay, well then what? Then what are you recommending?
I mean, it's just the browser. The browser is fairly adamant that even if we ship something that is asynchronous, they are never going to have an asynchronous version on their own. So whatever we do, whatever different API we generate that is asynchronous is just going to be inherently garbage to the browser side of the ecosystem.
I mean, if we ship an async version and they don't, what's going to end up is that people are going to polyfill it by just wrapping import.meta.promise .resolve into an async version, and that won't be on us. That will be on web platform. But
that's just friction for our users. We can just ship the synchronous version.
There are some strong static analysis benefits of the direct import meta.resolve as well, because build tools can see it. So it's a really useful thing if we can get agreement on it. So I just posted a link to Anne's comment where he says that it could be worth having a JS host discussion place for these kinds of things, which I think is a really positive step. Do we want to try and come to a conclusion today, or a position? I don't know how, I mean, we've gone way over time. If you have anything else to discuss.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're gonna fit the other proposal. Why don't we, how about this?
Okay.
Why don't I reply to that thread and suggest that we think we have a way to support a synchronous import.meta to resolve while preserving async resolve in our loader hooks API. Someone is going to try to implement that. If that PR is successful and survives code review and lands, then it sounds like we don't have a conflict and they're free to ship the API that they want. If that PR is not successful, then we should probably talk further before they ship anything. And that delays them, a few weeks or something, but this has already been a years long of effort. So they could probably presumably wait a little bit.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a way forward?
We could do that. If that gets delayed, we could just make the loader hook synchronous by default and push that through by first deprecating and then do a deprecation release.
Right.
And then
That would be the backup plan.
The backup. Okay.
But that's also less of a sure thing that would go through, because that also we have to get past anyone objecting to resolve becoming synchronous, the resolve hook becoming synchronous.
Wait, so would we actually need to do that because of Bradley's wizardry?
That's the question, is if the wizardry works, then it's that's why I call it the best of both worlds. We get what we want in that we get an async resolve hook and we get to match the browser API.
We can at least get the warning out to actually get feedback, because that's how we get feedback, is basically complain.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I don't want to put the warning if we think we're not going to make the change. If we think we're going to keep it as an async resolve hook, then there's no point in deprecating.
But if Chrome is, for example, looking at shipping this in a few weeks, say, then that means that we've got an incompatible API. So there is some kind of timeline there where we do want to put pressure on this. And especially if we go forward and say that our position is that we think we can, Chrome goes ahead and ships. And now we don't want to, keep the divergence for too long. So I just feel like it shouldn't get to a year.
We should deprecate our experimental import resolve, and that we should maybe put a deprecation on and say it's going to switch to a sync API that has only one argument. I thought you meant a warning on the loader hook resolve.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So I think we only need to warn if they use import meta resolve, but we can warn on all of them. That's fine. And just be like,
well, if we think we're not going to change the loader hook, then we shouldn't put a warning on it.
I don't know. I think either way, we can go back to what WG and say, we're going to run a test to see how breaking it is for us. And that will at least buy time. And so make the PR. That'll get
okay. So I'll say that we're
time
gonna put a deprecation on our experimental import meta resolve to warn people that
we're not deprecating import meta resolve. We're changing the API
whatever, right? A warning on it that it's a breaking change.
It's already an experimental API, so I don't think there needs to be any warning.
Okay, so I won't worry about that then. So
I would even keep the parent argument, because I'm hopeful that HTML could land that at some point as well.
So I want the warning because I don't know what custom loaders are doing out there.
A warning on what? The loader hook?
Yeah.
No. Import meta resolve, right?
Currently the current loader hooks are on the same thread. I don't know what this expectation is to get them off the main thread, timeline wise, but I don't think it'll be short. It's not going to be weeks. And if we can get some data on how many people are actually doing stuff, that's useful, especially for Chrome.
So what are you so you're saying in the short term, you want anytime someone registers a resolve loader hook, it's going to print some message that says are you
if you
using the
return
async
value,
nature of this hook? If so, please add a comment on this GitHub issue, something like that.
No, if it returns a thenable, if something has a then method on it as its return value, print a warning.
Rather return synchronously from resolve, because the resolve is going to be made sync and it will be a performance loss in future if you're doing asynchronous work.
It may potentially become sync. We don't have to say it will become sync.
Right.
I mean, if it's
but I thought the whole point of your wizardry was
now.
That's a timeline thing. This is all about timelines. It's great to have an idea that we're gonna fix everything before Chrome rolls stuff out, and forever everything's always synchronous. But we don't know even the use cases. Chrome doesn't even know use cases for people doing async operations.
We are
They're not
in
even
the
doing
position
user
of
investigation.
having that that feedback to give. I guess the risk is just if every loader hits the warning path and now every user has a warning. Maybe there's a way to have warnings that are specific for loader author time as opposed to users as well.
That's the thing. It's like we don't want to have every user of, say, TS Node getting this warning when only the TS Node
Which they
authors
would,
need to see it.
right.
Well, we don't have like a author mode for them.
Or something along those lines. But if that timeline presses, we can think about that. But yeah, we've maybe got a few weeks on that path at least, or a month.
Okay, so before we run out of time, do we have a consensus of what I could suggest of what would G that we're going to do? We're going to try to land a PR.
To see usage of asynchronous operations. In
See
our
usage of
resolve
async
hook.
resolve loader hook. Okay. We will also try to land a PR to move the
But
loaders.
That's something I don't like with the idea
off
of
thread.
putting a warning, is that we are going to be penalizing people who work through loaders that are supposed to work via the API that have been provided to them.
Okay, so why don't we just take out the idea for the warning for a second? Like we could do that without telling what we G about it.
Yeah,
So
maybe a first step is to provide a synchronous variant of the resolver hook that where you encourage the sync form in the docs. Note that the async form is possible, but might be deprecated in future, and at least do a documentation PR on that and change the loader hook.
I think that's a lot of churn
sync.
for the loader authors.
I mean, if we think that we're going to land what Bradley's suggesting of move them off thread and be able to preserve the async resolve hook, while then we would just change import meta resolve to be sync. If that's all possible, then that sounds like that's the solution.
Yeah, but I don't
So
have a timeline that's reasonable. Like a month
But-
timeline is insane to do that.
But no,
We don't
like,
even
can
have
we
usage
just say, okay, sure, Chrome ships its synchronous one, I don't know, next week or however fast they churn that out. And then we say, cool, we can do this, or we think we can do this. And we're targeting like 3 months. So if you want to
I'm
hit
just trying to
both,
get
be aware.
them to push out their release schedule so that we can actually test our solution.
Well,
Have they
okay. I mean, if
considered
they're
doing
willing
it
to
as, like, a
accept whatever.
domain experiment? I forget what Chromium calls it. They have like domain trials.
Origin trials, yeah.
Yeah. Might they consider that instead of like releasing it to the general public?
No,
and-
because it's not a compatibility thing for them. Origin trials are for experimental technologies for the web. It's not about compatibility with server-side runtimes.
Okay, but still, like, this is the what we hope to do is our solution. It sounds like we have a consensus on that. It's just that it's going to take a long time. So it's a question of like, are they willing to wait for us?
Well, we don't even need to finish it. We just need to get the proof of concept all done. And so
Okay.
like on the thread the guy just, well, put in the chat a little while ago, like seems fine with opening up a discussion across different hosts. Say, let's open up the discussion there. And we are going to see what we can do to provide compatibility. Like,
Yeah,
but we need time to actually go and, implement a proof of concept.
So something else is that if Chrome is absolutely not looking to change their API, then it doesn't really matter whether we make our change now or in 1 year. In
Well,
both.
Chrome may change their API. It's Dominic, who's the
Right,
editor of HTML, who doesn't want to talk about it.
It's more
Yeah,
that if we want to provide resistance or how much we want to,
I don't want to provide a ton of resistance. I just want time to make sure it works.
Okay. Well, then,
I mean, is there
perhaps
someone
a
else who could work on this
I mean,
besides you,
we've had
Bradley,
a
or
few
with you?
people. We have old design docs that like a Google intern was supposed to implement and never finished. So I mean, we got drive docs
it's
from
been
the
on the
old
plate
modules working
for a
group
while.
days.
Perhaps it's a tentative intent to syncify our hooks, but with user feedback, we still need to go through some implementation and user feedback process. And you know what? That's a good enough position. It's not a strong negative. It's saying that we're moving in this direction, but we're not doing it immediately, and it's not a guarantee. And then we need to find the loader implementation work to achieve it, certainly, and it's not going to be easy. So
I
mean,
can try to work on the offloading bit, but I think Bradley is probably much better to do it. I've done something-ish.
Well,
like it,
I
but
think
not nearly sophisticated.
I think Mail is right. Is like they're going to do what they want to do regardless of whatever we do. So it almost doesn't matter how quickly or slow we go because they're going to ship what they want to ship regardless. So what difference does it make?
I
they
think we
might
do-
change some minor things. Just not willing
but-
to change synchronous to asynchronous.
I mean,
Yeah.
we have the say in choosing not to convert, basically, and have our own position. But yeah, it sounds like we want to find that convergence, and I think that's a positive thing. I just hope we can work towards that.
All right, I put it in the Google Doc if you all can see that. Is this just right here? Does this sound like what we're landing on, or would anyone make any changes to this?
Let's see.
Can you make it bigger? I think you have like a crazy wide monitor.
Discuss trying to resolve.
Thank you.
Sure.
That seems fine to me. So the actual algorithms for doing some stuff off thread are in an ancient doc. Looks like it was made in 2019 by the modules working group.
If you want to put the links, any links that would be relevant in this Google Doc, that would be good. And then they'll be in the notes for the meeting.
I can open up that. This is wildly out of date from rebasing and everything, but that's fine.
All right, I need to drop and we're at time. I'm sorry.
Yep,
Kyle.
that's fine.
Do you want to,
Yeah,
we could
sorry.
schedule an in-between meeting next week, or you want to just wait 2 weeks and we can discuss ambient loaders then?
As you want. If you're not free next week, it's fine to make it in 2 weeks.
Okay, I think, why don't we continue the discussion on the PR, because I think there were some notes there, and then we can maybe we'll see the end of this week or so if that if everything is resolved on a PR, we can then at least land it as a proposal and then discuss it, I guess, a week from today. If those discussions are still ongoing, I guess we could discuss it 2 weeks from today. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Cool.
See you.
Thanks.